There's nothing we can do in our sinful nature that can please God by bringing Him glory. Paul says later in Romans 8, those who live according to the flesh, that's the sinful nature, cannot please God. Which leads us to Paul's last point in explaining what's wrong with the world. Because mankind, in his sin, is suppressing the truth about God, and instead embracing an exchange in truth, worshiping and living for the creation instead of our Creator, humanity is under God's wrath. We go back to chapter 1, verse 18, and see everything Paul has said so far began with this one single truth, that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Now, for most people, the word wrath conjures up all kinds of images, mostly ones that come from myths and movies. But the word wrath in the Bible simply refers to God's hatred of sin. And it's typically used in conjunction with God's judgment and just punishment for sin. The Bible does speak of a coming day of judgment, where God's wrath will involve fire and the destruction of all wickedness. But that's not what we're experiencing right now. What Paul says is that we're experiencing the revealing of God's wrath. That is, we're just catching the beginning glimpses of what God's wrath will mean. And Paul's description of what this means can be summed up with his repeated use of the term, God gave them over. They exchanged the truth about God's glory. Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires. They exchanged the worship of the Creator for the creation. Therefore, God gave them over to dishonorable passions. They exchanged the natural for the unnatural and considered the knowledge of God not even worth retaining. And therefore, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not be done. What this means is that God's wrath is being revealed not in His active delivery of vengeful acts of death and destruction. Rather, He is simply allowing us to experience, in a preliminary way, what it means to live without Him by removing us from His presence and handing us over to ourselves. In sin, we have seized the life that God gave us to be lived for His glory, and we have chosen instead to live it for ourselves. And God's judgment is to let us have it our way. But we'll never experience satisfaction for our souls this way. We were made for God. As St. Augustine once said, "Thou hast made us for Thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in Thee." Let's just review what we've learned. In answer to our second ultimate question, what's wrong with the world? We learned from Genesis 3 about Adam and Eve's fateful decision to seize for themselves the life that God had given them to be lived for Him and with Him. In judgment, God removed them from His garden temple dwelling, which really meant consigning them to life in the world apart from His presence. But what we learned from the Apostle Paul in Romans 1 was what the true effect their decision had on us. By sinning against God, Adam and Eve became sinful. Consequently, we've all inherited the sinful nature, which means we are by nature incapable of even wanting life with God. Instead, Paul describes how, by the very lives we lead, we suppress the truth about God, and in place of God, we embrace an exchange of truth by giving the glory due to God to His creation instead. We worship and live for the creation instead of our Creator, such that nothing we do is done for God's glory. And all of this is the evidence that our sin has brought us under God's judgment. God has handed us over to our own choice. We've rejected our Creator, and so God is revealing His wrath by allowing us to experience, in a preliminary way, what it's like to live without Him. Like I said at the start, in the grand story of the Bible, this is the bad news. It's a real-life tragedy that is regrettable and heartbreaking. But as hard as it might be to hear, it's necessary in order to truly grasp and understand and appreciate the good news about Jesus that makes up the rest of the grand story of the Bible. So in our next video, we're going to look at the good news about God's gracious response to the fall. Remember, it was God's eternal purpose to create a temple dwelling in which to dwell with His creation. And God's purposes will not fail. And so in our next video, we're going to look at God's plan of redemption. That is, the steps He took to undo the tragedy of the fall and rescue us from our sin. You don't want to miss that. So we'll see you then. You just watched a very small part of our video series called Seeing the World as Jesus Sees It. If you want to learn more about how the Bible can change the way you see everything and transform your life, then click on the link in the description below. And thanks for watching.